Greetings, students. Mr. Little here, and today we're going to look at Chapter 26, Part 2, The Role of Asia in the Early Modern World Economy. By the end of this video, you should be able to answer these two essential questions. How did East Asia, and specifically China, play a role in the newly internationalizing economy? And how did immigration during this time shape economic exchange within the region of Asia? So let's talk a little bit about the internal economies of East Asian nations. Within China, as well as within Japan and parts of Korea, there was a great amount of what we would call internal expansion, and that is the taking up of more land for farming, as well as the introduction of new crops that allowed populations to grow. So, for example, China grew from 100 million in 1500 to 225 million by 1750 and almost doubled. That's a pretty impressive growth. This is in part because of an increase in the intensity of farming. So, for example, terracing of mountain ranges that had not previously been farmed. And while this is going to have disastrous ecological consequences down the road, initially it did allow for a great big population boom, as well as all this new land that the Qing dynasty had conquered in Central Asia, and they moved out settlers. In addition, in the Ming in particular, production of goods continued to expand as it had under the Song dynasty, as well as the Yuan dynasty. There was continued innovation in porcelain production. And while I am personally not a porcelain expert, I know that people who study this stuff for a living are always talking about how great and awesome Ming dynasty porcelain is. So it's safe to say that luxury goods continue to be produced at a very high rate. Silk and iron continue to be produced at a very high rate. The economy of China continued to be the largest economy in the world until the early 1800s. So even with the onset of the Industrial Revolution, the sheer size of China continued to make it the world's largest economy for a very long time. Now let us talk of the newly internationalizing economy. And one of the biggest indicators of the global trade would be the global trade in silver, which some historians have called the birth of the global economy, truly international East and Western hemispheres put together. We've had trade routes before, but they might have been trans-regional, but they were not global, right? Silk Road goes between Asia and Europe. Indian Ocean trade goes from Africa to Asia, but nothing covered the entire world quite like the silver trade. Now, recall that historically gold and silver and copper, along with various metals and various shells, such as the cowrie shell, have been used across Asia as a form of currency. However, with the conquest of the Americas and the end of the Warring States period in Japan, there was a huge influx of silver into the global economy. You might recall the Potosi mountain, where the silver mines were, that flowed out of the mines and into the Spanish Empire. So Spain sent probably, I don't remember the numbers exactly, but sent a good chunk of its silver, not west to Europe, but east on galleons over to Manila after 1571, when the city was founded. Some people actually date 1571 as the year that the global economy was born. And in Manila is where the Spanish would trade with the Chinese expat community there for their Chinese goods, and in return they would get silver. There was also silver coming from Japan as well, and some of this actually went through Southeast Asia, like what is now Vietnam and parts of the Spice Islands. But either way, as silver continued to float around the globe, China became the world's silver sink, where all the silver just kind of poured into. And this was in part driven by the demand for Chinese goods, such as tea and porcelain and silk. Became items of European royalty. You may recall from chapter 23 how a porcelain tea set or a silk painting, a silk tapestry was a luxury item for the wealthy across Europe. And so if you had the money, you would get that porcelain set. And part of that is because suddenly there was silver flowing everywhere and China could supply the goods. So China took in about 100 metric tons of silver every year at the peak of the trade in the 1630s. But long before that, the Ming government shifted its policy to collect its taxes in silver, not in rice. So what we would call taxes in kind, that is, taxes paid via either labor or via agricultural products, is now officially replaced with taxes collected in hard currency. Now, how this is going to eventually cause a serious problem for the Ming dynasty as well as Spain was that there would be inflation. The Ming government did not adjust how much they collected. And so as more silver flowed into the country, it became worth less, and the Ming took in less and less, even though they technically were collecting taxes from more and more people. The trend of importing silver would actually continue into the Ming. It would succeed the Ming Dynasty and continue into the Qing Dynasty as well, only shifting the balance during the Opium Wars in the 1800s, but we'll talk more about that when we get there. But the role of China as the world's silver sink, and removing products from China and Asia in return for American silver, is widely seen as the birth of the first global economy. A great example would be this ewer, which is a water basin, which was designed for Portugal in Ming China with this Portuguese royal seal on it. And so this porcelain piece is one great example of that new global economy. And here's a map of some of the trade routes of the silver trade, where while some of the silver went west directly to Spain, some of it went further around the coast of Africa, was used to buy goods in South Asia, which were then traded in Southeast Asia, whereas some of it went directly from Lima up to Acapulco and then took the currents across the Pacific Ocean to Manila and then back the other way. Interesting thing about the galleon system is that the galleon system was an incredibly deadly job, and probably about a 2/3 of every crew did not survive because of the length of the journey and the inability to store provisions for that long. Now, the galleons went on the northern stream and the southern stream to go directly to Manila. What they didn't do was go directly across the Pacific Ocean. If they had, they would have discovered Hawaii before the British did, and that could have been a nice stopping point for their journey, but they didn't. And so there's a lot of interesting questions as to how deadly the galleon trade would have been if they had had Hawaii as a replenishing port on their journey. So something to think about. One of the things that comes up when we talk about China and the international system is sort of this idea of Chinese isolation, right? It's said that the Ming Dynasty and the early Qing Dynasty opposed foreign trade. And while that's true, they did in part because Confucian values did not look fondly upon merchants as people who don't know their place in society. And both the Ming and the Qing were afraid of unrest, as they had seen during the Mongol times, as had been seen in Mongol times when several Muslim communities revolted against the government in these trading entrepôts. This did not mean that they were isolationists. So the Ming Dynasty, while it forbid foreigners from coming to China and doing business, did not prevent its own people from going out and doing business. The Qing would try to do that, not very effectively. But during the Ming Dynasty, again, how do you think all that silver got into China? It had to be traded somehow. The Qing Dynasty would allow Europeans and other merchants to trade, but only in Guangzhou, which is one of the largest cities in China today, located in southern China. This was known as the Canton system, for the English word for the city of Guangzhou, and it would last until the mid-1800s. And so while they were only allowed to trade in this one city, as can be seen by the McCartney embassy, which attempted to get a better trade deal from the Qing Dynasty and was flatly just told, no, you cannot. You can trade in your one city and be happy about it. The idea of describing China as like an isolation society would be very much an understatement. And this is in part because of the Chinese diaspora, which allowed trade to continue with China via these diaspora communities. Remember that a diaspora is a group of people that are disconnected from their geographic origin. And so you have large-scale Chinese communities in the Philippines, Singapore, Vietnam, and the Spice Islands. And while there may have been Chinese merchants living in these communities in earlier times, now we begin to see the establishment of really large communities that do the trading with other merchants from China. And Southeast Asia, in many ways, was sort of the China of the silver trade that China was to Europe. So whereas Europeans spent their silver in China on things like porcelain and silk and tea, the Chinese sent a good portion of their silver to Southeast Asia to get things like sandalwood, birds' eggs, and other very rare things that only grew in Southeast Asia and did not exist in China itself. The Chinese community in Manila in particular was a real key element in creating the trade between China and the Spanish colony in Manila. There was also a certain involvement of the Japanese in Manila as well, but the Chinese community is much more well known. And this, of course, made them very made some of them very wealthy and caught the suspicion of the Spanish government. In one particular case, a Ming Dynasty official came to visit the colony, and this prompted the Spanish to panic and think that the Ming Dynasty was about to invade the island. And so they proceeded to then massacre all the Chinese people in Manila. Although the population eventually rebounded. But this is a lesson that, fear of foreigners and suspicion of foreigners is as early as the global economy itself. So, nonetheless, the Chinese diaspora is proof that China was not necessarily isolationist. It just maintained a very strict control over who it did business with. There's also the famous Japanese diaspora. Now, I mentioned earlier that Japan was also a source of silver. Japanese mines in the southern part of Japan were a major silver source. And this also was traded with the Spanish in Manila, since the Japanese were forbidden from going to China to do trade because of a long history of Japanese pirates harassing the Ming Dynasty. Or at least the Ming said they were Japanese. We don't know for sure if they were. But nonetheless, Japanese merchants did work in Manila. There's evidence that Japanese merchants were trading with the Hawaiians in the mid-1600s before the Europeans ever discovered Hawaii. And we do know there were communities of Japanese in the Spice Islands who did business with the Dutch. We know that Japanese may have sailed as far as India during this time. We found maps that Japanese merchant sailors used, which included India, as well as the coast of East Africa. But more than merchants, there were also masterless samurai whose masters may have been killed during the Wars of Unification, or they may have been dishonored and thrown out by their masters. Whatever the case may be, you have these highly trained, skilled warriors who now don't have a job. And so many of them actually left Japan and went to work for the Europeans or other local rulers in East and Southeast Asia. One very particular interesting case was Yamada Nagamasa, Yagamasa, who was a mercenary adventurer in Thailand and who effectively ran the Thai government for a good 20 years, appointing kings, killing heirs that he didn't like. Eventually, he was driven off by the indigenous people of the area, but he was a typical of like a mercenary going around and sort of living a glorious, rebellious life. We also know that there were at least a few masterless samurai working in colonial Mexico, guarding low-level Spanish government officials. Now, we don't know anything about them. There's just one document that says there was a Japanese daimyo who converted to Christianity and went to go see the Pope, and he traveled through Mexico. And one document attests to the fact that some of his soldiers stayed in Mexico and worked protecting local government officials. So we don't really know much about those samurai who stayed in Mexico, but nonetheless, there was at least one samurai in Spanish colonial Mexico. And so, again, sort of like with China, these merchants also helped facilitate, kind of greased the wheels of international trade in Asia during this time. So you should be able to answer those two questions from the beginning of the video. I want to thank you for joining me. This is Mr. Little, and I will see you next time.